5,000 square cubits, 45 massive cedar columns, foundation stones weighing 50 tons each. A single hall spanning 22.5 meters, wider than an NBA basketball court. Built without steel, without concrete, without cranes, without a single power tool. This was Solomon's palace. And here's the detail that has troubled biblical scholars for 3,000 years. It was 4 times larger than the temple, the very dwelling place of God Himself. Why would the wisest king in history build his own residence 4 times bigger than the house of the Almighty? Was it vanity? Misplaced priorities? The first sign of spiritual decline? Or have we been asking the wrong question all along? The answer isn't found in theology alone. It's hidden in the engineering. The year was approximately 960 BC. Jerusalem stood as the young capital of a young kingdom. Solomon had just completed the most ambitious sacred construction project in Israel's history, the Temple. 7 years of labor, 70,000 burden bearers, 80,000 stonecutters. And when the Ark of the Covenant entered the Holy of Holies, the cloud of God's glory descended with such intensity that the priests could not even stand to minister. The temple was finished, but Solomon wasn't. 1 Kings chapter 7 opens with a single verse that has sparked centuries of theological debate. Solomon was building his own house 13 years, and he finished his entire house. 13 years! Nearly double the time spent on God's temple. And when you compare the dimensions, the contrast becomes even more striking. The temple measured 60 cubits long by 20 cubits wide, roughly 1,200 square cubits of floor space. The main hall of Solomon's palace, 100 cubits by 50 cubits, 5,000 square cubits, more than 4 times the temple's footprint. Now, Solomon didn't build this alone. He couldn't. Israel had shepherds, farmers, and soldiers. They did not have architects who could design megalithic structures. They did not have engineers who understood how to span distances that would challenge builders for millennia to come. Enter Hiram, king of Tyre. The Phoenicians were the master builders of the ancient Mediterranean. They had timber, the legendary cedars of Lebanon. They had maritime logistics to ship massive materials across the sea. And, most importantly, they had centuries of construction knowledge that Israel simply did not possess. This partnership would produce something unprecedented. But first, Solomon's engineers faced 5 seemingly impossible problems. How do you roof a space wider than a basketball court using only wood? How do you illuminate a forest of columns? How do you move 50-ton stones uphill to Jerusalem? How do you make 5 separate buildings function as a single organism? And why, theologically, practically, spiritually, would you build your palace 4 times larger than God's house? Let's solve them, one by one. The heart of Solomon's palace complex was a structure called the House of the Forest of Lebanon. 1 Kings chapter 7 verse 2 gives us the exact dimensions: 100 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. In modern measurements, that's roughly 45 meters long, 22.5 meters wide, and 13.5 meters tall. Here's the engineering crisis those numbers created. Cedar wood from Lebanon was the finest building material in the ancient world. Strong, aromatic, resistant to rot and insects. Kings across the Near East paid fortunes to obtain it. But cedar, like all wood, has a physical limitation that no amount of money can overcome. A single cedar beam cannot safely span 22.5 meters. It doesn't matter how thick you make it. The physics don't change. Under its own weight, plus the weight of the roof above, a beam that long will sag. It will crack. And eventually, catastrophically, it will fail, bringing the entire structure down. Modern structural engineers confirm what ancient builders learned through painful trial and error. The safe spanning distance for timber beams of that era was roughly 10 to 15 cubits, maybe 12 meters at the absolute maximum. Solomon needed to cover 50 cubits. The math simply didn't work. So his engineers, almost certainly the Phoenician specialists from Tyre, designed something brilliant. A hypo-style hall. The text tells us the roof rested on 4 rows of cedar columns, with cedar beams laid across the top. By inserting rows of massive columns throughout the interior, they divided that impossible 50-cubit span into multiple smaller spans of roughly 12 to 13 cubits each, perfectly within the safe load-bearing range of cedar timber. And this explains the building's unusual name. The House of the Forest of Lebanon wasn't just poetic metaphor, it was literal description. When you stepped through those doors, you found yourself surrounded by columns, massive cedar trunks rising toward the ceiling, packed so densely that walking through the hall felt like wandering through the mountain forests where the timber originated. Scripture mentions 45 columns arranged in rows of 15. Some ancient manuscripts say 3 rows, others say 4. The arithmetic has puzzled scholars for centuries, but the engineering principle remains clear regardless of the exact count: distributed load architecture. What's remarkable is that this same structural solution, columns supporting a roof to span distances impossible for single beams, wouldn't become standard in European architecture until the Gothic cathedrals rose 2,000 years later. Solomon's engineers discovered it independently in the 10th century BC. But solving the span problem created a new one. They weren't even close to done. 45 columns solved the roof problem. 45 columns also created 45 shadow casters. Picture the scene. Sunlight enters through doorways on the perimeter. Immediately, it strikes a wall of cedar trunks. The light scatters. Shadows multiply. The deeper you walk into the hall, the darker it becomes. This wasn't merely an aesthetic inconvenience. It was a functional disaster. 1 Kings chapter 10 tells us this hall stored 300 large shields overlaid with gold. 300 smaller shields, also gold. This was simultaneously an armory and a treasury, a display of military might and economic power designed to intimidate foreign delegations before they ever reached the throne room. Gold needs light. In shadow, gold looks like dull bronze. Only when light strikes its surface does gold blaze with that unmistakable radiance that speaks of wealth and power. A dark hall filled with golden shields defeats the entire purpose. But here's the engineering catch. More windows mean weaker walls. You can't simply punch holes wherever you want without compromising structural integrity, and windows at ground level would be blocked by the very columns holding up the roof. The solution appears in 1 Kings chapter 7, verses 4 and 5. Window frames arranged in 3 rows, with windows facing each other in 3 tiers. This is clerestory design. Instead of placing windows at eye level where columns would obstruct them, Solomon's architects positioned the windows high on the walls, above the column capitals, near the roofline. 3 horizontal bands of openings running the length of the building, each tier facing its counterpart across the hall. Light entered from above. It streamed downward in dramatic shafts, bypassing the forest of columns entirely and flooding the central floor space where those 300 golden shields hung waiting. But the benefits extended beyond illumination. Those 3 tiers of windows, facing each other across the open space, created what modern engineers call the chimney effect. Hot air rises. In a hall filled with people, soldiers, officials, foreign dignitaries, body heat accumulates. The warm air climbed naturally toward the ceiling and escaped through the upper windows. Meanwhile, cooler air was drawn in through the lower entrances, creating constant circulation. Passive climate control. No machinery, no energy consumption. Just intelligent window placement. They invented air conditioning. In 960 BC, Now imagine standing in that space. Feel the gentle movement of air through the hall. Breathe in the fragrance of cedar. Everywhere cedar. That distinctive sweet resin scent that filled the lungs with every breath. Watch 300 golden shields catch the morning light streaming from above, blazing like captured suns against the cedar walls. This was architecture designed to overwhelm the senses. The roof was secure, the light was solved, but the real challenge was just starting. Everything above ground depends on what lies beneath. 1 Kings chapter 7 verse 10 contains a detail that modern engineers find almost unbelievable. The foundation was laid with large stones, costly stones, hewn stones, measuring 10 cubits and 8 cubits. Let that sink in. 10 cubits is approximately 4.5 meters. 8 cubits is roughly 3.5 meters. These weren't bricks. These were megalithic blocks of Jerusalem limestone, each one longer than a modern SUV. Now calculate the weight. Jerusalem limestone, the Meleke stone that ancient builders prized for its workability and strength, has a density of roughly 2.5 tons per cubic meter. A conservative estimate for a block 4.5 meters long, with modest height and width, puts the weight at 30 tons. Realistic dimensions push that figure to 50 tons or more. 50 tons. The weight of a fully loaded semi-truck. Now imagine moving that stone uphill to Jerusalem, without wheels capable of bearing the load, without engines, without cranes, without hydraulics. Just human muscle, simple machines, and extraordinary coordination. We know it was possible because the evidence still exists. In the Western Wall tunnels beneath modern Jerusalem, archaeologists have documented foundation stones weighing over 500 tons. The technology existed. The question is how? The answer lies in a technique called ashlar masonry. 1 Kings chapter 7 verse 9 describes the process. Costly stones, cut to size, sawed with saws, finished on every face, both the visible exterior and the hidden interior surfaces. Ashlar construction uses stones cut with such mathematical precision that they fit together without mortar. No cement, no adhesive. The sheer weight of the blocks pressing against each other creates stability that has lasted 3,000 years and survived countless earthquakes. But the precision required is extraordinary. Each surface must be perfectly flat. Each angle must be exactly 90 degrees. Any deviation and the stones won't seat properly. The Phoenician craftsmen left their signature in a distinctive technique called drafted margins. They carved a smooth, flat border around the edge of each stone's visible face, leaving the center slightly raised in a rough boss. This technique appears consistently at archaeological sites throughout Solomon's kingdom: Megiddo, Hatzor, Gezer, a unified royal blueprint executed by specialists from Tyre. The moving process itself combined simple physics with massive manpower. First, quarry the stone at sites below Jerusalem's elevation. Second, cut and dress each block at the quarry site. Removing waste material before transport saves enormous effort. Third, construct earthen ramps leading up to the construction site. Fourth, roll the stones on wooden cylinders, replacing each roller as it emerges from behind and carrying it forward. Fifth, use lever arms and fulcrum points to shift the block into final position. 1 Kings chapter 5 records the labor force: 70,000 burden bearers, 80,000 stonecutters in the mountains, plus 3,300 supervisors. 150,000 workers, organized for stones. With foundations secure, they faced their most complex challenge yet: building 5 different structures that had to function as a single organism. Solomon didn't need a palace. He needed a pentagon, combined with a White House, combined with a Supreme Court, combined with a royal residence, combined with a diplomatic guest house. 5 distinct functions, 5 different sets of requirements, all integrated into one coherent complex. The House of the Forest of Lebanon served as armory and treasury, requiring massive interior volume for storage and display, plus maximum security for irreplaceable assets. The Hall of Pillars functioned as a reception area and waiting room, a covered portico 50 cubits by 30 cubits where foreign delegations and petitioners could gather before being admitted to the royal presence. The Hall of Judgment contained the throne and served as courtroom, demanding specific acoustic properties for royal pronouncements and a visual design that communicated absolute authority. The royal residence housed Solomon himself, requiring privacy, comfort, and protection. And finally, a separate palace for Pharaoh's daughter, Solomon's Egyptian wife, addressed both diplomatic protocol and theological sensitivity. 2 Chronicles chapter 8 records Solomon's reasoning. His wife could not dwell in the house of David because the places where the Ark of the Covenant had been were holy. An Egyptian princess, raised in polytheistic worship, could not occupy spaces sanctified by God's presence, so she received her own palace. Separate structure, connected yet distinct. The layout followed a logic of progressive privacy. Layer 1, most public, was the House of the Forest of Lebanon. This is what foreign ambassadors encountered first. 300 golden shields gleaming in clear story light. A forest of columns demonstrating technical mastery. The message was unmistakable. This kingdom possesses wealth, power, and sophistication. Think carefully before opposing us. Layer 2, the buffer zone, was the Hall of Pillars. Here visitors waited. Here crowds were managed. Here anticipation built before the next threshold. Layer 3, semi-private, was the Hall of Judgment. Cedar paneling covered every surface from floor to ceiling. This wasn't decorative excess. Wood absorbs sound, preventing the harsh echoes that stone produces. When Solomon pronounced judgment, his voice carried with perfect clarity, authoritative, resonant, final. And at the center of this room stood the throne. 1 Kings chapter 10 describes it in extraordinary detail. Ivory overlaid with pure gold, 6 steps ascending to the seat, 12 lions, 1 at each end of each step, standing guard, armrests flanked by 2 more lions. Nothing like it had ever been made for any other kingdom. Layer 4, private, was Solomon's personal residence, behind the public spaces, maximum security. Layer 5, diplomatically separate, was the Egyptian queen's palace. The result was an architectural organism where each space served its function while contributing to a unified whole. Public intimidation leading to private judgment. National display flowing into personal dwelling. But all this sophistication raises an uncomfortable question, one that has haunted theologians for 3 millennia. Let's face the accusation directly. The temple took 7 years. The palace took 13. The temple covered 1,200 square cubits. The palace covered 5,000. The numbers seem damning. Critics throughout history have pointed to these figures as evidence that something shifted in Solomon's heart, that the king who asked God for wisdom was beginning to prioritize personal glory over divine worship. Josephus, the 1st century Jewish historian, noted the time discrepancy. He attributed the temple's faster completion to divine assistance, implying the palace lacked that supernatural help because it lacked the same priority in God's eyes. The skeptic's argument writes itself. If Solomon truly loved God most, why did he spend nearly twice as long building his own palace? Here's the engineering answer. Factor 1. Pre-gathered materials. 1 Chronicles chapter 22 records that David spent years stockpiling resources for the temple before Solomon ever began construction. Gold, silver, bronze, iron, timber, all warehoused and waiting. Solomon inherited a head start on the temple. The palace had no such advantage. Factor 2. Complexity differential. The temple served one sacred function. The palace served 5 distinct functions, requiring different architectural solutions, different acoustic properties, different security arrangements, different everything. More complexity equals more time. Factor 3. Scale reality. 4 times the floor space means 4 times the material to quarry, transport, cut, and place. 4 times the coordination. 4 times the problem solving. 13 years isn't spiritual laziness, it's mathematics. But the theological answer runs even deeper. Ask yourself, does God need square footage? The Holy of Holies, the most sacred space in the entire temple, measured 20 cubits by 20 cubits by 20 cubits. A perfect cube, roughly 30 feet in each dimension. Inside that cube, 2 golden cherubim, the Ark of the Covenant, and the presence of the Almighty Creator of the universe. 1 priest entered that space, 1 time per year, alone with God. You don't build a gymnasium for that encounter. You don't need 5,000 square cubits for 1 priest and the presence of the infinite. Sacred space isn't measured in floor area. It's measured in holiness. But an empire's administrative headquarters? That requires storage for 300 shields, treasury for a kingdom's wealth, throne room for judgment, waiting halls for delegations from Egypt, Phoenicia, Sheba, residential space for the royal family and their household. Different purposes demand different architectures. A hospital isn't designed like a home. A factory isn't designed like a sanctuary. Solomon understood what we sometimes forget. Sacred and administrative serve different functions. So if the engineering makes sense, and the theology makes sense, what exactly have we been missing? And then it becomes clear. For 3,000 years, we've asked the wrong question. We asked, why was Solomon's palace bigger than God's temple? As if size equals importance, as if square footage measures devotion, as if the king who prayed for wisdom instead of wealth would suddenly lose that wisdom when it came to construction priorities. The right question is, what does each building's size reveal about its purpose? The temple was small because holiness is intimate. Think about what happened in that space. The Holy of Holies, the most sacred location on earth, was a cube, roughly 30 feet in each dimension. Inside, 2 cherubim with wings stretched wide, the Ark of the Covenant containing the tablets of the law, the mercy seat where God's presence dwelt. 1 priest, once a year, alone with the Almighty. You don't need 5,000 square cubits for that encounter. You need purity. You need reverence. You need awe. The temple's dimensions made a declaration. God doesn't need space. He needs surrender. The palace was massive because governance is complex. Armories require volume for 300 shields, each plated in gold. Treasuries require security for a kingdom's wealth. Throne rooms require acoustics for pronouncements that decide life and death. Diplomatic spaces require room for delegations from the most powerful nations on earth. Solomon didn't build bigger because he valued himself more than God. He built bigger because running an empire demands more real estate than hosting the divine presence. The palace's dimensions made a different declaration. Human administration requires space. Divine communion requires heart. This is the wisdom of Solomon that we've been missing. He understood something profound about faith and life. Sacred and secular aren't competing categories. They're complementary dimensions of a faithful existence. The temple faced upward, humanity reaching toward God in worship. The palace spread outward, divine wisdom flowing into human governance, justice, provision, and protection. Both were necessary. Both were holy in their purpose. Both rose from the same Jerusalem limestone, built by the same hands, funded by the same treasury, dedicated to the same God. You don't measure devotion by square footage. You measure it by whether each space, large or small, fulfills its God-given purpose. The wisest king who ever lived built two great structures in Jerusalem, one small and intimate, for meeting God, one vast and complex, for serving God's people. Both were exactly the right size. Solomon's palace wasn't just stone and cedar. It was a statement inscribed in architecture. The God who dwells in intimate mystery also reigns over the vast complexity of human civilization. Every courtroom, every treasury, every waiting room and throne room, all under his sovereignty. Perhaps that's why Solomon could write in Proverbs, "In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths." All your ways, sacred and secular, temple and palace, prayer closet and boardroom, both matter. Both require wisdom. Both can glorify God. What surprised you most about Solomon's palace? Was it the 50-ton foundation stones moved without machinery? The passive air conditioning system designed 3 millennia ago? Or the theological reason behind the size difference? Drop your answer in the comments below. I read every one. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss it. Thanks for watching. And remember, every stone in Solomon's Jerusalem was placed with purpose.